The bench beside the Rideau Canal had always been mine in a particular way. The second one past the footbridge, the one that faces east so you get the morning light without squinting. My wife Helen and I used to walk there on Saturday mornings before the city woke up. After she passed, I kept going alone. It was the one habit I couldn't bring myself to break. That Tuesday in October, I had just sat down with my coffee, dark roast, no sugar, the way I've taken it for 40 years, when my chest began to feel strange, not painful exactly, more like something pressing inward from all sides. My hands started to tremble. I set the cup down on the armrest and told myself to breathe slowly, the way I always do when my body decides to remind me that I'm 67 and not 43 anymore. I don't remember falling. I only remember the cold of the gravel path coming up to meet me, and then nothing at all. When I opened my eyes, a woman was crouched beside me, her fingers working at the clasp of the smartwatch on my wrist. "What are you doing?" The words came out thin, barely a voice. "My daughter gave me that." She stopped and looked at me directly. Not startled, the way a stranger might be, but with the steady attention of someone accustomed to emergencies. She had gray hair cut short and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and she said quietly and without any hesitation at all, "I know. That's exactly why I'm taking it off. I want you to understand who I was before any of this happened, because the person I am now is not the same one who sat down on that bench. My name is Duncan Cavanaugh. I spent 34 years as a civil engineer with the federal government here in Ottawa, and I retired at 65 with a decent pension and the quiet satisfaction that comes from having done honest work for a long time. I am not a confused old man. I live alone in the same house my wife and I bought in the Glebe 30 years ago, and I manage perfectly well on my own. I want to be very clear about that, because what I'm going to tell you might make it seem otherwise. Helen died 22 months before all of this began. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed in March, gone by September. The speed of it still strikes me as almost disrespectful, as if the universe decided there wasn't time to be gentle about it. We had been married 38 years. We had one daughter together, Rebecca, who was living in Vancouver at the time with her husband Jasper, and who had flown back to Ottawa for the last 2 weeks. I was grateful for that. After the funeral, she flew home again. I don't say any of this to make my daughter sound callous. She had her own life, her own pressures, and grief does strange things to the relationships between people. What I will say is that in the 22 months after Helen died, my daughter called me maybe once every 3 weeks. She texted more, but the texts were short. "How are you? Thinking of you. Talk soon." That was fine. I understood. I had Ian, my old colleague from the government, who I met every Thursday morning at the Tim Hortons on Bank Street. I had my volunteer work with Engineers Canada, helping review submissions from university students for their design competitions. I had the canal. I was lonely, yes, but I was functioning. I was myself. Then one afternoon in late August, my daughter called, and her voice had a different quality than usual. Softer somehow, more careful. "Dad, Jasper and I have been talking and we've made a decision. We're moving back to Ottawa." I sat down in the armchair by the window, the one Helen had picked out and I'd never brought myself to replace. "That's a big move," I said. "What brought this on?" "We've been worried about you," she said. "I know you'd never say so yourself, but it's been almost 2 years, and you're there alone, and, Dad, I just want to be closer. I want to be there for you the way I wasn't when Mum was sick." The last part landed somewhere soft. I told her I was glad I meant it. They arrived on a Friday evening in early September with 2 cars and a moving truck. My son-in-law was polished in the way some men are. Good haircut, firm handshake, the right amount of eye contact. I had never quite warmed to him, but I'd never said so to my daughter. He was attentive that evening, carrying boxes, asking about the neighborhood, making coffee without being asked. He had the easy manner of someone very good at first impressions, and I told myself I was being uncharitable. My daughter loved this man. That was enough. They had rented a place in the Glebe, 2 streets from mine, close enough to be present, far enough to feel intentional. On Sunday, 2 days after they arrived, my daughter came over alone with a small box wrapped in tissue paper. "I brought you something," she said, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. "We ordered it before we left Vancouver." Inside was a watch, Not a traditional one, a slim, dark-banded smartwatch with a clean digital display. It looked expensive and medical at the same time. "It's called the Vitali Pro," she said. "It monitors your heart rate, your blood pressure, your sleep quality. If anything looks unusual, it sends an alert to my phone so I can check in on you." She paused. "Your last checkup showed your blood pressure was a bit elevated, Dad. Nothing serious, but Dr. Morrison mentioned it. It's so I don't have to worry so much." I looked at the watch. I looked at my daughter. Her face was open and earnest in the way it used to be when she was a child, and wanted something badly enough to be completely honest about it. "How much did this cost?" I asked. "It doesn't matter. Your health matters." It cost, I later found out, just over $2,000 for a device I'd had no idea I needed. But I was 67, and my wife was gone, and my daughter had just moved across the country to be close to me. And when she fastened the watch around my wrist and said, "Promise me you'll wear it all the time, even when you sleep," I said I would. I promised. The headaches started within the first week. Not severe, more like a persistent pressure behind my eyes that came and went without warning. I had never been prone to headaches in my life. I mentioned it to my daughter, and she said it was probably the seasonal change, the shift from summer to fall, the drier air. That seemed reasonable. Ottawa autumns can be harsh in their own quiet way. The dizziness followed a few days later. I was standing at my kitchen counter making toast when the room tilted slightly, and I had to grip the edge to steady myself. It passed after a few seconds. I sat down, drank a glass of water, and decided I'd call Dr. Morrison's office in the morning. When I mentioned the dizziness to my daughter during her daily check-in call, she had started calling every morning between 8 and 8:30, asking how the night had been. What the watch readings showed, she told me to hold off on calling. "The watch already has all your data, Dad. Jasper's been looking at the readings, and he says what you're describing is completely consistent with an adjustment period some people have with new health monitoring. Your nervous system is recalibrating. Give it another week." My son-in-law had been looking at my readings. I hadn't known that. I'd assumed the alerts went only to my daughter. I didn't call Dr. Morrison's office. What followed happened slowly enough that I almost didn't notice it happening. My Thursday mornings with Ian became, first, every other week. My daughter mentioned that Ian tended to get me worked up about city politics, and the watch was showing that my heart rate spiked during stressful conversations. Then Ian called one Thursday, and I told him I wasn't feeling well enough to go out, which was nearly true by that point. The dizziness had become a daily visitor. The chest tightness I'd first noticed weeks earlier was returning in the evenings. My daughter had also gently suggested I consider stepping back from my volunteer work at Engineers Canada. "Just temporarily, Dad. The commute downtown, the meetings, you're pushing yourself harder than you need to. The readings show you're not recovering overnight the way you should be." I'd been doing that volunteer work for 4 years. I loved it, but I stopped going. There was a financial advisor meeting somewhere in there as well. My daughter mentioned it would be smart for me to have someone help organize my estate, my RRSP, the house, a small investment account Helen and I had maintained for years. The advisor she suggested was a man named Curtis, who turned out to be a friend of my son-in-law's from their university years. Curtis was pleasant and thorough, and I left the meeting feeling vaguely as though I had agreed to more than I understood. I couldn't have told you exactly what, only that something about it sat wrong for the rest of that week. By the second month, my world had shrunk to the size of my house, and the distance between it and my daughter's place 2 streets over. I hadn't planned to take the watch off. It happened on a Tuesday morning in October, the kind of cool, clear day we get in Ottawa when the leaves are still clinging, but the air has already turned. I was in the bathroom washing my hands, and the watch felt suddenly, unbearably heavy on my wrist. I slid it off without thinking, placed it on the edge of the sink, stood there with my bare wrist under the light. Within 20 minutes, I noticed that the pressure behind my eyes had eased. Within an hour, the dizziness was gone. Sat at my kitchen table without my coffee cup, trembling. I breathed without counting the breaths. I sat still and felt, for the first time in weeks, like my own body again. My phone rang at 9:47, my daughter. "Dad, the watch isn't transmitting. No good morning. No how are you. Her voice was stripped of the warmth it usually carried. "I took it off," I said. There was a silence. I could hear her breathing. "Why would you do that?" "Because when I took it off, I felt better." "Dad." Her voice shifted again, lower, more controlled. "You felt better because of anxiety. You've been anxious about wearing it and your body responded to removing it. That's not the watch making you sick. That's your own nervous system. You need to put it back on." "I don't think I do," I said, and saying it out loud felt like stepping onto solid ground after weeks on something unstable. "Dad, I need you to listen to me very carefully." The warmth was gone entirely now. "If you refuse to manage your health properly, I'm going to have to speak to someone. I can contact Adult Protective Services and request a wellness assessment. I don't want to do that, but if you're making choices that put you at risk, I don't have another option. I'm your daughter. I'm responsible for you." I stood in my kitchen for a long time after she hung up. Then I walked back to the bathroom and put the watch back on. That night I sat in Helen's armchair and understood, in the specific way you understand things when you've run out of ways to explain them away, that what was happening to me was not love. It looked like love. It used the language of love: worry, care, responsibility, protection. But love does not threaten. Love does not tighten around you until you can't breathe. I had spent 38 years with a woman who loved me, and I knew what that felt like, and this was not it. I just didn't yet know how to get out. The morning I collapsed on the canal path, I had worn the watch for 7 weeks. Her name was Dorothy Wren. She lived 2 streets north of the canal and walked that path every morning at 7:45. She had retired 4 years earlier after 32 years as a registered nurse, the last 18 of them in a cardiology unit at the Ottawa Civic Hospital. She knelt beside me on the gravel with the calm efficiency of someone who has been in enough emergencies to know that panic helps no one. She checked my pulse. She checked my breathing. She looked at the watch on my wrist with a particular expression. Not recognition exactly, but alert, careful attention. "How long have you had this?" she asked. 7 weeks, I managed. "Has it helped?" Something about how she asked, not assuming, just asking, made me answer honestly. "No, if anything, I've been worse." She didn't say anything for a moment. She helped me sit up against the back of the bench, and then she took my wrist in both hands and examined the watch closely, turning it, studying the band where it met the skin. "I've worked in cardiology for a long time," she said slowly. "I've seen a great deal of monitoring equipment. I've never seen this model. It's called the Vitale Pro." She looked up at me. "There's no such thing." We sat there in the October morning with the canal going still and silver beside us, and she told me she wanted, with my permission, to take the watch to someone she trusted, a former colleague who now worked in medical device regulation at Health Canada. I gave her permission without hesitation, because I had been waiting, I realized, for someone to tell me I wasn't imagining things, that I wasn't simply old, that there was a reason I felt like a man slowly disappearing inside his own life. She took the watch off my wrist and I breathed the cold air, and my hands stopped shaking. The report came back 2 days later. Dorothy called me, and her voice was measured and steady, the way a good nurse's voice sounds when she has difficult information to deliver. The Vitale Pro was not a registered medical device in Canada. It was not approved by Health Canada in any category. When examined, the watch casing contained components that had nothing to do with health monitoring: a GPS tracking chip, a miniaturized microphone, and circuitry consistent with a device designed to emit low-frequency electromagnetic signals. Her colleague described the configuration as deliberate and sophisticated. The electromagnetic emissions, she explained, were consistent with causing headaches, dizziness, fatigue, and irregular heartbeat, particularly in someone with any underlying cardiovascular sensitivity. I sat with that for a long moment before I spoke. "She knew that," I said, "my daughter. She knew what it would do." "I don't know what your daughter knew," Dorothy said carefully, "but I think you need to call the Ottawa police. I want to stop here and tell you something honestly. When I made that call, I was not certain. I was 67 years old and I was considering reporting my own child to law enforcement, and every instinct I had been raised with, protect family, assume the best, find another explanation, pushed against what I was doing. I made the call anyway, because I had removed a device from my wrist and felt the symptoms vanish, because I had been threatened with an Adult Protective Services assessment if I refused to comply, because love does not threaten, and because somewhere in the past 7 weeks, the voice that had been trying to get my attention, the one saying something is wrong, had grown too loud to keep pushing down. The officers who came to Dorothy's house were thorough and unhurried. They listened. They examined the watch and the documentation Dorothy's colleague had produced. They asked about the meeting with Curtis and wrote down his name. They asked whether any new documents had been put in front of me. Powers of attorney, estate directives, anything I might have signed without fully understanding. I thought about that meeting and said I wasn't entirely sure. It turned out I had cause not to be sure. The investigation took 3 weeks. What the police found and later shared with me through the victim liaison officer assigned to my case was this. My son-in-law had accumulated significant debt. A failed real estate venture in Vancouver had left him and my daughter $160,000 in arrears, with more behind it. The house they had rented in the Glebe was funded in part by a loan connected to a fraud network that had, in the previous 18 months, targeted 4 other elderly homeowners across Ontario and British Columbia. The method was consistent each time. A family member already in financial trouble was recruited. An elderly relative with real estate equity and retirement savings was identified. A surveillance device disguised as a health aid was deployed, and a pattern of isolation and psychological pressure was established. The goal in every case was financial control, typically through power of attorney or redirected estate planning. The document I had nearly signed at Curtis's office was a continuing power of attorney for property, drafted in language that would have given my son-in-law and my daughter joint authority over my RRSP in the family home. I had not signed it. I had said I wanted to think about it. That hesitation, the simple fact that I had not signed that day, was the only reason the damage remained limited to what it was. My daughter and her husband were charged with criminal fraud, elder financial abuse under the Criminal Code of Canada, criminal harassment, and unauthorized interception of private communications. The charges relating to the modified watch connected to the broader network investigation, which was being coordinated between the Ottawa Police and the RCMP. My real doctor, Dr. Morrison, the one I had been told not to call, examined me within a week of the watch being removed. My blood pressure was normal. My heart was fine. The elevated readings that had apparently been showing on the monitoring app were fabricated outputs from the fraudulent device. There had never been anything wrong with me that wasn't being caused by the watch itself. I updated my will with a lawyer my daughter had no connection to. I revoked every document Curtis had prepared. I called my financial institution and confirmed that no instructions were on file that I hadn't personally and clearly given. And then slowly, I started finding my way back. Ian and I resumed our Thursday mornings at Tim Hortons. He didn't push me to talk about any of it until I was ready, and when I finally told him the whole story over 2 cups of coffee and one of those blueberry muffins they do, he sat with it quietly before saying, "I knew something was off, Dunk. I just didn't know how to say it without you telling me to mind my own business." He wasn't wrong. I probably would have. I went back to my volunteer work at Engineers Canada. The students on this year's review panel didn't know anything had happened, which was exactly how I wanted it. I sat in those meetings and talked about load-bearing design and structural integrity and felt, for the first time in months, like a person with expertise rather than a person being managed. Dorothy and I began walking the canal path together on weekday mornings. It started as a practical arrangement. She lived nearby. We were both early risers. The route was the same for both of us. It became something else gradually, without either of us making a formal decision about it. Some things don't need to be decided. They just settle into place like the right foundation under solid ground. I think about Helen often, still. I don't think that will ever stop, and I wouldn't want it to. But I've learned, in the hard way that some lessons insist on coming, that loving someone who is gone doesn't mean you stop living. Helen would have been furious about what happened to me. Not at me, but for me. She would have seen through my son-in-law in the first 10 minutes. And she would have said something precise and cutting about it that would have ended the whole thing before it began. She was always better than me at seeing people clearly. What I know now that I didn't know before is this. The instinct that told me something was wrong was not confusion. It was not anxiety. It was not the unreliable perception of a man who was grieving and getting old. It was accurate. It was, in fact, the most reliable thing about me during those 7 weeks. The small voice that kept insisting quietly and persistently that this is not what love looks like. I should have listened to it sooner. I tell you that not to shame myself, but because I believe there are others who have that same voice in the back of their minds right now, doing exactly what I did. Explaining it away, giving the benefit of the doubt, telling themselves that concern from someone who loves you cannot possibly be harm. It can be. Control and love are not the same thing, no matter how fluently control speaks love's language. Real love does not track your location. Real love does not isolate you from the people who know you best. Real love does not tighten around you every time you try to breathe freely. And real love, the actual kind, the kind that holds up under any kind of pressure, does not threaten you when you say no. I still walk to the second bench past the footbridge most mornings. Dorothy comes with me now, or I go alone when she has an early appointment. I bring my coffee, dark roast, no sugar. The canal in November goes gray and serious, which suits me fine. I am 67 years old. I live in my own house, in my own neighborhood, on my own terms. I make my own decisions. And I know exactly what my own heartbeat feels like when something is wrong.